Sounds good.
This meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us this session today. This is the fourth panel of our international conference, Great Power Competition, a challenge to the rule-based order. And the title of this panel is China's Foothold in Oceania and Pacific Island, a Security Concerns. So I would like to invite Andrew here and Mr. Samant to moderate this panel. And before I handing over to them, I would like to announce that the views presented and expressed here are personal, should not be construed to any organizations and institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Indu. Good afternoon, good evening, or good morning, depending on where you're viewing this panel. It is with great pleasure that I welcome the audience and the panelists today to the fourth panel of the consortium's Indo-Pacific conference. This panel is on China's foothold in Oceania and Pacific, a security concern. I'm Andrew Erskine, the moderator for this panel. The Indo-Pacific region is the emerging center of power in the multipolar rules-based order. Specifically, the region has 6% of the world's population, has 7 of the world's most populous countries, and has 65% of the world's oceans and 25% of the world's landmass. The region's vital shipping lanes pass through small channels that connect the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Strategically, whoever can control or regulate these waterways can impede or proliferate the flow of capital goods. Due to these factors, whoever can attain hegemony over these channels and waterways will be at the center of the global economic engine of the future geoeconomic order. To reinforce this prospective hegemony over the region, China is actively pursuing engagement strategies within the Indo-Pacific sub-regional peripheries, namely Oceania and the Western Pacific. China's recent inroads in pursuing Kiribati and the Solomon Islands to sever diplomatic ties with Taiwan and inking a security pact with the Solomon Islands highlights the ingenuity of Chinese hegemonic thinking, filling in the great power gap from a disengaged United States. To discuss the importance of the region and how China is establishing and building upon its foothold over political, economic, and military dynamics, we have 3 distinct panelists. Colonel Jeffrey Holman is a former U.S. Marine and a commissioned officer in the U.S. Air Force, with 30 years of leadership and program management experience. He currently services as a chief of the Security Force Division at the Pacific Air Force and is a member of the consortium of Indo-Pacific researchers. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you very much.
We have Dr. Satoru Nagao, and he is a non-resident fellow at Hudson Institute based in Tokyo, Japan. And from December 2017 through November 2020, he was a visiting fellow at the Hudson Institute based in Washington, D.C. His primary research area is U.S., Japan, India security and India security cooperation. He has authored numerous books and journal articles on matters related to the Indo-Pacific. Welcome. Our last panelist, Dr. Peter Dombrowski, is a professor of strategy in the Strategic and Operational Research Department at the U.S. Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. Previously, he has held the positions of chair of the Strategic Research Department, editor of the Naval War College Review, co-editor of the International Studies Quarterly, and associate professor of political science at Iowa State University. He has authored over 65 publications. The most recent is a book, The End of Grand Strategy, U.S. Maritime Operations in the 21st Century. Prior to our commencement, I wish to lay out the structure of this panel. After the introductions, each panelist will have 10 to 12 minutes to speak on the prepared remarks. Following this, we will move to questions from the audience and myself and Majis, who is here as well. If at any time the audience has a question, please write it in the comment section. Now, without further ado, let us begin. Jeffrey, can you deliver your prepared remarks?
Thank you very much. I truly appreciate the invitation to participate in this conference. And these are certainly exciting and intense geopolitical times. especially with respect to China's activities in Oceania and the greater Pacific. So as I took a look at the topic for this panel, I thought we need to assess China's foothold in the Pacific. And I think it's important to note how strong that foothold is and whether or not China is in a position to expand that foothold. So while China's certainly been busy in the Pacific, they've really only been active in a few places. According to the Lowy Institute's Pacific Aid Map project, China's aggregate development financing has continued to decline since its peak in 2016. And although China targeted aid to Kiribati and the Solomon Islands in 2020, as previously mentioned, total financing has dropped to 187 million, its lowest point since 2008. And preliminary data indicates a continued decline in 2021 and 2022. So again, how strong is their foothold? Personally, I don't think it is very strong. While Kiribati and the Solomons sit in potentially strategic locations, the fact that China's activities have been highly publicized has forced those island governments to assure the international community that those projects will not host or support Chinese military operations. As to the questions of whether China is in a position to expand that foothold, I'd say it's highly unlikely. And I say that for a couple of reasons. First, China's forays into the Pacific have roused the Western powers from their slumber and flooded the aid landscape with alternative sources of financing. We're all very familiar with China's security pact with the Solomon Islands, which hit the press back in April, and Wang Yi's tour of the Pacific in May, where he failed to close the deal with 10 island nations on sweeping trade and security agreements. Those moves were countered by Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong's visits to Fiji, Samoa, and Tonga. And the US-New Zealand joint statement that highlighted their shared commitment to the Pacific Islands. That statement noted with concern the security agreement that China and the Solomon Islands had signed on April 1st and warned against the establishment of a persistent military presence in the Pacific by a state that does not share our values and security interests. You also saw the Biden administration jump into action with its launch of the IPEF, or the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, which initially includes Australia, Brunei, India, Indonesia, Japan, the ROC, Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. The launch of IPEF was followed by the September US Pacific Island Country Summit, which promised cooperation on key issues such as climate change, pandemic response, economic recovery, maritime security, environmental protection, and advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific. It also included $810 million in additional Pacific aid and $600 million in economic assistance for the South Pacific Tuna Treaty. And of course, you have the supporting fires coming from the US National Security Strategy, National Defense Strategy, as well as supporting fires from our allies and partners. For instance, Australia's evolving security pacts with Fiji and Papua New Guinea. Before I move on to my second point, I think it's important to acknowledge that China has received a lot of negative press over the last few years for its debt trap diplomacy. You really just have to look at Pakistan and Sri Lanka. And does Kiribati and the Solomons think their countries will prosper with Chinese support? I personally wouldn't bet on it. And neither will most of the other developing nations these days, as they approach Chinese offers with much more caution and skepticism. Secondly, China has some major challenges at home and abroad that I believe will curtail its adventuring in favor of addressing more pressing issues and concerns at home. China's slowing economy, exacerbated by the prospects of a global recession, including reduced domestic consumption, real estate crises, tech sector crackdowns, export controls, mass COVID lockdowns, BRI loan restructuring, and demographic challenges are all taking their toll. At the conclusion of the CCP's 20th Party Congress, stock markets welcomed Xi's new term with a meltdown on the first day, with Chinese stocks in Hong Kong tumbling by the most they have since 2008, and the yuan weakening to a 14-year low. Add the negative publicity and international pressure generated by China's human rights abuses, and the resulting negative attention from radical Islamic terrorism, and the backlash caused by China's increasing wolf warrior diplomacy, and you have the recipe for a regional power that very few countries will want to partner with. So in the end, I think it really comes down to credibility and reputation. The US and our allies and partners are ultimately interested in a free and open Indo-Pacific, where all countries are considered equals in support of a rule-based international order. If you look at China, that's not what they want, and that's not what any autocracy wants. In the words of Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi in 2010, China is a big country, and you are all small countries, and that is a fact. China is interested in cooperation and mutual benefit, but only on its terms. Now, I'm not saying that the US and the West has a perfect record. We've had plenty of broken promises, I'm sure. But let's face it, if you're a Pacific nation looking for a partner who will best assist you and your people tackle the challenges of the future, would you pick the US, Europe, Canada, the UK, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, South Korea, India, and the Philippines? Or would you pick China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran? That's a pretty easy choice if you ask me. And I'd like to thank you again for the invitation to participate. I'll apologize now if my comments seemed a bit hawkish, but being a professional military member, that's kind of where I come from. And I welcome any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Jeff. Your insight is definitely well noted and definitely well needed in this growing, strategic competition between a Sino-centric and US-centric regional competition and engagement. I would like to now give the floor to Dr. Satoru Nagao.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm afraid to make a presentation just after the very good presentation. So, but I must do it. This is my work. I need to explain the South Pacific is important why, especially the context of the US-China competition. I will make presentation next 10 minutes. And in the past, during the US-Soviet Cold War, China has used the sea between Australia and New Zealand, a test range of the China's ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. So to collect data, China dispatched a missile tracking vessel by crossing the South Pacific. So that age for China, this is just a test range. But that was in the past. Now China focusing on the South Pacific more. So that's a big problem. So China has another interest now. So along with China's military modernization, China's defense line has expanding. That's a problem. For China's defense, the core interest was how to defend the coastal cities of the mainland, such as Shanghai, Hong Kong, these cities. So to defend the coastal cities, China is setting up the first island chain from Japan, Taiwan, Philippines, or the full of the South China Sea, and the second island chain from Japan to Guam, these lines. But so, for example, when the U.S. aircraft carrier battle group goes to China to attack China, China will stop the group in these lines, first island chain, the second island chain, by using missiles, planes, and naval forces. That is their strategy. So, for example, recently China is increasing their missile arsenal, such as the DF-21D, the anti-ship ballistic missile, or DF-26, people call anti-Guam missiles. So to deal with such situations, the US side developed new bases, Tinian Islands, where it's just side of Guam, to prepare the China's attack to Guam. So if this Tinian basis is alternative basis, if China attack Guam, I think. And so, but at the same time, US relocate their bases in Australia. From this area, within the first island chain or second island chain, Australia will be the main places to deploy the forces, because the US has a very long range asset, the US can do indeed. So US deploy Marine in the Darwin, or US also deploy B-52 in Australia. Maybe US will deploy, I think. So these things has really happened. So China is pushing the United States from the first island chain, second island chain, and now also we start to call the third island chain. That third island chain, including the South Pacific. And recently, the Chinese Navy expanded its military activities and going beyond the second island chain to the third island chain. The third island chain is maybe Alaska, Hawaii, and New Zealand, this kind of line. So because the third island chain is too far from China's coastal line, so no one can say that this is a defensive move. But, and in this case, the South Pacific is a route to expand China's main military activities. So if Chinese Navy set up bases in the South Pacific, it will be more difficult to track China's naval ships in the Pacific, I think, because China can deploy naval ships anytime near Hawaii or other region between US and Australia easily, and they attack Alaska or the US western coast. So in the past, China's admiral said, Chinese officials said the US to take Hawaii east, and we, China, will take Hawaii west and the Indian Ocean. Then you will not need to come to the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean, and we will not need to go to the Eastern Pacific. So if anything happens here, you can let us know, and if something happens here, we will let you know. Of course, the Chinese said this is a joke, but this is not a joke, we can laugh. So if China set up the base beyond the second island chain and they come to the third island chain, it will be real. Between World War I and World War II, maybe we should remember the fact Japan has expanded influence in the South Pacific. So Japanese know what happened. Saipan, the Guam, etc. Japan's mandatory territory. And many fisheries of the Okinawa Island of Japan went to the South Pacific. But such kind of the Japan's expansion deteriorated the relation with Australia and the United States. So now, view from Japan, China is walking the same route. So what should we do? The feature of the China's territorial expansion is the timing indeed. We compare what kind of type of the threat Russia and China. Russia is burglar. When they find a chance, they use the military. But in case of the China, indeed, China is thief. When they find the power vacuum, they steal it. Basics has exploited the situation whenever it finds the power vacuum. It's a pattern. For example, what happened in the South China Sea? China occupied half of the Paracel Island just after the France withdrew in 1950. This is, in this case, half of the Paracel Island, but another half they took when the US withdrew from Vietnam in 1970s. And in 1980s, when the Soviet troops reduced the number in Vietnam, China expands the influence of the Spratly Island and occupied 6 beaches. In 1990s, China occupied Mischief Reef just after US withdrew from Philippines. So every time military balance changed and they find the power vacuum, they steal it. So that's why I said that China is thief. So if so, what should we do is simple. We try to maintain military balance and fill the power vacuum. So in the South Pacific, we should show the presence or donating equipment or the train their local forces. We need to maintain our presence. And another feature of the China's territorial expansion is non-military control. China has used the fogging infrastructure project known as the Belt and Road Initiative to expand Sophia's influence. Countries with a significant Chinese investment and debut hesitate to criticize China, even when it flouts international rules. So China has also using the vaccine diplomacy or the other support to expand their influence. So as a goodwill gesture, but this is not goodwill gesture for the local. Indeed, China tried to expand their influence. So these non-military methods like the infrastructure or delivering the vaccine, so that is a problem. So what should I do? It's a little simple. So in this case, we need to leave from China's economy or China's non-military methods. We should prepare the alternative infrastructure project, or we should deliver the vaccine, these kinds of things to neutralize China's influence. But in this case, the current economic system in the Indo-Pacific depends on China. So many global companies build their factories in China. Many companies are selling their product within China. So that economic structure itself needs to change. So US and its allies and like-minded countries should relocate their factories and find new market elsewhere. So that's why the TPP, which create a new market as an alternative, or IPEF, also the project to create a new market instead of Chinese market. This is the right way. So therefore, to tackle China's expansion, we need to cooperate each other. Quad, AUKUS, TPP, IPEF, etc. These cooperation are very important. So the more China escalates the situation, the more the cooperation of the US side will be the institutionalized in the Indo-Pacific. That is the best situation for us. That is my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nagao. I would also now like to pass the floor and the chair to Professor Yoichiri Sato, who has joined us now. So, Professor Sato, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I came late. I had the wrong time on my calendar, and I'm having some fever also, so I tried to be sober. I think one of the key issue about this the Sino-US competition rivalry in the islands domain is obviously it's about who has access to those islands, but in order to get access, you need political influence, and that competition has been taking place already, and you can see the Solomon Island hosting China and declining the port call by the U.S. Coast Guard vessel and so forth. And the Kiribati seems to be leaning toward China now. And this is worrisome because of Kiribati's closer location to Hawaii. So this kind of influencing in domestic politics is a very important aspect. And one thing the US, Japan, Australia, they all tend to forget is that we're not talking to the Pacific Islands enough. And we came from above and impose our views, whether it's about FOIP or what, and tell the Pacific Islands country how they are important. But I think Pacific Island countries, they have their differing interest, whether it's about tuna fishery or the sea level rise or sustainable economic development, tourism development, you name it. Unless both sides talk to each other and kind of make a mutually acceptable bargain, US, Japan, Australia, they're not going to have access to the Pacific Islands. So how do they do that? Well, I think Japan showed pretty bad example during Prime Minister Abe. And, Japan hosts this annual Pacific Island Summit meeting and bring all Pacific Island countries at one table. And a meeting like that is a great opportunity to listen to them. But instead, Abe tried to have the meeting adopt anti-North Korea resolutions over this the missile and the nuclear proliferation issues. And frankly, Pacific Island states can care less about those issues. And I think it was really a misplaced effort. And sure, it's important that they don't register North Korean vessels for, small fee, which would be not so small in terms of their perspective. It has happened. North Korea registered its vessel in the Pacific Island country, and of course, those vessels are used for evading sanctions. And yes, indeed, it's important that the Pacific Island states are on board the sanction regime. But I think the way of bringing up the issue was not right. It gave a really bad impression on the Pacific Island countries. So yes, it's very important that bring them on board, but I think we need to work on the manner of talking to them. So that would be my comment.
Thank you very much, Professor Sato. Now I'd like to turn the floor and give the floor to Professor Dom Broski. Can you build off, or can you take a different perspective on China's foothold on Oceania and the Pacific? Maybe indicating what the United States or what other middle powers are doing in the region.
Okay, thank you. I will do my best. And I'm going to do something. It's very rare for me to be using slides. I actually don't use slides very often, but I'm going to share my screen and work off the slides, which I hope will be helpful. So stand by, and they're coming up right now. Can you see them?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to take the theme of the panel and provide an American perspective. And when I say an American perspective, I'm not going to try to do a whole lot that's personal, but I'm going to start with the precepts of some American grand strategic concerns that are articulated in American strategic documents over the first 2 years of the Biden administration. But I won't just stick with the official line. I'll then transition a little bit to some of the particular security concerns, and I hope this will work out for everybody. So let's see if I can get this to work. Okay, I'm going to say this again, even though Indu did a nice job of providing a disclaimer, but I feel compelled to give my own disclaimer, especially since we're being recorded. I'm not talking on behalf of the U.S. government, the Naval War College, the United States Navy, or any other government agency. The views are mine and mine alone. I think that should be understood. So the first thing I want to do is talk about sort of the public assessment, the American sort of, what's the presentation of the American position to the Indo-Pacific in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. And the first major document is the Indo-Pacific strategy that was issued in February 2022. Now, most of this stuff is familiar to you all, so I don't feel like I'm going to belabor it. In fact, not only are they familiar to all of us, they're fairly straightforwardly American grand strategic perspectives in the Indo-Pacific for the last couple decades. A free and open Pacific, connected economies, connected societies, prosperity, secure and resilient to the kind of shocks and changes that I'll talk a little bit about at the end of my presentation. I put secure in red because in red font, because I'm going to talk more about the security piece than the others, in part because I sit at the Naval War College, although by training I'm a political economist, so I love to talk about economics and so forth. So if you parse the Indo-Pacific strategy, you find this sort of 5 generic threats, or maybe better put, challenges to the American perspective. And the first is, obviously, we've heard from our first 3 presenters, is the People's Republic of China. And it particularly calls out 3 sort of generic aspects of the challenge posed by the PRC. The pursuit of a sphere of influence in the Indo-Pacific. It seeks to become, on a global scale, the world's most influential power. And more specifically, the PRC has used coercion and aggression across the globe, but most acutely, as it says in the document, in the Indo-Pacific. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. The second big objective is to deal with climate change. It's unclear from this document whether this is in a particular order, but I suspect it actually is. And the notion of climate change, which particularly hits many of the countries in Oceania and the rimlands of the Indo-Pacific, are enormously impacted by stronger typhoons, all sorts of aspects that you all know. The other challenge or threat is the pandemic. And it's not just the COVID-19 pandemic that we've experienced in the last couple of years, it's also future pandemics, because smart money amongst the public health community is that COVID-19 is only the most recent and surely not the last pandemic that'll cross transnational borders and cost people lives and make the economy suffer. Another challenge, and I called out the I called out North Korea in part because it's called out in the document, but the destabilizing activities of the DPRK with the proliferation of nuclear weapons, the testing, the firing we've all seen in recent days, and the possibility that it might seek to coerce South Korea and or the United States using nuclear weapons. The final challenge is very broad, but I think it resonates particularly in terms of climate change and the COVID-19 epidemic. Natural disasters, research scarcity, internal conflict, and governance challenge. And a lot of these governance challenges are intimately related to climate change and the pandemic and so on. So this is what the Indo-Pacific strategy sees as the challenges in the region. The national security strategy, oops, I think my slides are out of order, but that's okay. National security strategy in the United States, these are some highlights, and it echoes what we've already heard, particularly from our first presentation. No region is more significant to the world and to everyday Americans than the Indo-Pacific. It is the seat of dynamism, sorry about that, dynamism in the American economy. Sorry so much, I cannot tell you. It is a source of dynamism in the global economy, the source of innovation, a huge share of trade and finance, and American strategists recognize this. Just a brief aside, which I didn't say because my slides are out of order. The national security strategy comes out after the Indo-Pacific strategy. It's more general, it's a global perspective, but for obvious reasons, there's a lot in the national security strategy that came out a couple of weeks ago or a week or so ago about the Indo-Pacific. The strategy also is very clear. The PRC presents America's most consequential geopolitical challenge. We're not being shy anymore. We're not being coy. This is no longer the period of the peaceful rise. This is even beyond what we talked about with the reset under the Obama administration. It's very clear that the geopolitical challenge presented by the PRC is aware and shaking the U.S. government. Not only is the PRC, the Indo-Pacific challenge, important for the region and for American interests in the region, it has a great impact on the rest of the world. So in a couple weeks, I'll be talking with the Europeans about what's the European role and what are the European interests in the Indo-Pacific. So half a world away, because of the economic dynamism, because of the trade relationship, because of financial relationship, the Indo-Pacific is central, not just to the United States, but also to the Europeans amongst others. The other thing that national security strategy says, which I'll speak a little bit more about, is the need for and the hope for deepening defense and technology integration amongst allies, partners, and friends of the United States in the region. So the PRC's rise, which is largely military, is in part responded to with a deepening of not just the alliance of political and diplomatic relationships, but the military component. So I'm going to switch now to another topic, which is not simply the strategic documents of the United States, what it means in hard security terms. And I'm going to do this by talking about sort of national security or defense or military scenarios that people that do strategy and think about national security consider when looking at the American role in the Indo-Pacific. And as you'll see, a lot of this has implications for partners, allies, and of course for adversaries or potential adversaries in the region. And these scenarios are those things that will challenge American interests that we've already articulated, that pose question marks for both the military component of American power, but also the other aspects, economic, political, diplomatic, and information. So what are these scenarios? What do strategists worry about? So the first thing is familiar to all of you. You know, we've all heard discussions about this, and this is gray zone operations and what they call hybrid war. And this is allegedly and reputedly, and I think it's been demonstrated, something that the Chinese, whether they call it gray zone operations, a hybrid war, or don't, is something they've used in the South China Sea and elsewhere to assert political influence and economic influence. It includes everything from using coast guards as a coercive instrument to building islands and geographic features on the waterfront, to using aspects of lawfare and all these sort of things that are below the threshold of war or even conflict, but are used to assert Chinese interests, not just against the Americans, but all the other littoral states in the region. That's a big set of scenarios. It might be the most difficult for everybody in the region, all countries in the region, to cope with for all kinds of reasons I'm happy to talk about. The second big scenario is the most challenging militarily, the most challenging for national security, not just for the United States, but for American friends and allies, including, of course, the Taiwanese, but also partners like Australia or Japan and potential partners like India or some of the other small littoral states. The Taiwanese scenario is very multifaceted. We can talk about it. The kinds of threats posed include a blockade, both air and at sea, to sort of, I hate to use this language, but I think you understand what I'm talking about, to sort of choke out the Taiwanese, to assert economic pressure on the Taiwanese in support of reunification with the PRC. The second challenge is a cross-strait invasion, actually invading Taiwan and trying to unify by force, by direct application of power, oftentimes as an amphibious component. Again, extremely challenging, not only for the Taiwanese, but for the Americans, should they choose to get involved. This is the whole question of strategic ambiguity. A third aspect, and there's many other permutations that can work together, is air and missile attacks. Essentially, again, using sort of coercive mechanisms to pressure the Taiwanese to reach some kind of a settlement that's favorable to the PRC. In red are the things I'm focused on that are most directly challenging to the United States. The other ones are also scenarios that are important to the US, but other countries as well. North Korean aggression, whether it's nuclear, whether it's conventional, whether it's some combination thereof, which seeks to revisit the settlements, or I shouldn't say the settlements, the frozen conflict in the Korean Peninsula. This is a possibility that American planners have long been frightened by. Frightened is not the right word. Let me say that again. Have long been puzzled about how to deal with militarily and diplomatically and politically. A third or fourth sort of big scenario is the PLA becoming a blue water, the PLAN, the PLA Navy, becoming a blue water Navy. Now, this is some decades away, I believe, and we can talk about that. but certainly the PLAN has demonstrated the ability to operate globally, not just in the Asian littoral or within the island chains, but increasingly in the Eastern Indian Ocean, the Mediterranean, and even farther abroad. Now, this is where, if you want to talk about Oceania and also places and bases across the Indo-Pacific, where it's essential that the PLA, so to project power using navies and even amphibious operations, you can't just do it from your ships. You really need bases, you need refueling stations, you need places to refit, to reload, to sustain your forces. And we've seen, and there's a lot of good scholarship on the PRC's efforts to create a series of bases across the region. Now, it's an interpretive question whether these are military or economic or some combination, but it's certainly a challenge for American interests. I'm not gonna, I know I'm running out of time, so I'm not gonna go over the other scenarios, but they're also extremely important. Our renewal of India-Pakistan hostilities, a renewal of war in the Indian Ocean or the Persian Gulf, in other words, the greater Middle East. And then finally, of a lesser case, but also threatening global commerce, is piracy in the Horn of Africa. How am I doing on time? Do I have a couple more minutes?
Yes, by all means.
Okay, so, and there's another thing, and I just did a presentation about this in London. I'm not going to belabor the point, but one thing that's really rising to the attention of many strategists and officers and political figures in the region is the shadow of the future might be economic warfare. And the slide I put up is really just a sort of decorative thing to make the point, is that obviously China is very reliant on global commerce. All the other countries in Northeast Asia and across the region are reliant on global commerce. This is the sea lines of communication. But these sea lines of communication can be contested because there's a whole series of choke points. There are geographic spots where there is a narrowing of the commercial transit passages, and potentially one side or the other can actually coerce the others using economic instruments, using blockades or embargoes, or all kinds of ways of slowing down commerce, which has economic impact. I just wanted to put that up there to show you that it's not just the use of force in a traditional sense, it's also economic pressure. And this can go in both directions, from the PLA and the PLAN and the PRC towards American friends and allies in the region. Now, in thinking about this, if you're a strategist, there's a whole bunch of they call it planning factors, and I'm using the term very loosely. Look, for the United States to achieve its interests, obviously we need allies and partners, right? The United States cannot exist in the region and cannot project power and influence without allies. Otherwise, there'd be no reason or there'd be no opportunity to do so. As strong as the American Navy is, we need bases in Japan and Okinawa, in Singapore, in Australia, and the potential in the times of conflict to cooperate with other countries in coalitions of the will. And this is really a big thing for thinking about, the security in the Western Pacific and the Indo-Pacific in general. The other aspect, and I won't belabor this, is the growing set of institutions. Now, famously, there's no Asian NATO, but there is a sort of bilateral hub and spoke relationships and developing partnerships, including things like ACRIS and, that technology integration and using, developing weapons and interoperability that represents. Another big flaming factor is how many U.S. forces and of what type are going to be in the Western Pacific. We famously had a reset where supposedly we're going to reallocate 60% of U.S. forces abroad to the Indo-Pacific. I think maybe the numbers work, maybe they don't, but I think the promise of that really hasn't been lived up to in reality, maybe not yet. And then finally, this whole notion of economic coercion that I've already alluded to. So in a globally integrated economy with the potential for deglobalization and the challenge for authoritarian regimes in different kinds of capitalist societies, economic coercion goes in both directions. And it's unclear if there are political and potentially military conflict where the economic coercion plays out and what the role of all the countries in the region is. Because China, and this is sort of contrary to our first presenter, China has a far larger economic reserve of hard currency, for example, to use to bribe, pay off, seduce other countries than the Americans do. Now, it's a lot more complicated than that, but it's a complicated question. All right, last slide and I'll stop. So people that think about strategy and scenarios talk about wild cards and black swans, things that, we're going along at a particular pace and we know that there's all these challenges to American interests. We know there's challenges to the individual nations in the region, there's threats, but what kinds of things can upset the apple to really make a big difference in what we think about as national security specialists? And I'm just going to go through these and say a brief word. Nuclear use. Obviously, if one of the countries in the region decides to use nuclear weapons for any purpose, this, I hate the term game changer, but this is probably a game changer, breaking the nuclear taboo. And as we've seen in the Ukraine-Russia war, the possibility of threatening nuclear use is a real thing in the modern world. It's a real thing in the third decade of the 21st century. Another wild card that we don't think about is regime collapse. It's not clear that certain countries are infinitely sustainable. And I'll just use North Korea because I don't think there's any North Koreans in the audience. That regime seems very solid, but as we've seen with other authoritarian regimes in the past, collapse can be very quick. And that sounds like a good thing because it could be a real chaotic, complicated thing for the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Chinese, and of course the Americans. What about peaceful reunification? The big, this seems far-fetched. We know the Taiwanese don't want to reunify. We've seen the public opinion polling, but in the back of the mind, not only is independence a possibility, but also peaceful reunification. Now, if you read the really good article in the recent issue of International Security, there's people that claim that Taiwan is the linchpin to American strategy in the Western Pacific. I'm not one of those people, but Taiwan does play a central role, and what happens with Taiwan drives a lot of the security architecture in the region. I'm just going to go down and just highlight a couple ones. So, global climate change and the crises associated with it, whether it's droughts or floods or typhoons or, long-term famine in some regions, this is inherently politically and economically destabilized. And it may seem localized, but given an interconnected global economy, it's really important for each country in the region. And external actors are often asked to play a role. And the United States famously helped with tsunami relief, years and years ago. The Chinese tried to do so and tried to create a capability. But climate change brings a whole set of challenges that often don't make it to the top level of national security specialists and strategists thinking. But I would submit that it's absolutely crucial to thinking about, in particular, the Indo-Pacific. So I'll shut up now. I can talk about any and all of it. I hope that did what you needed, Indu. And with that, I will shut up and let you guys ask questions. Trying to share my screen now.
Thank you, Peter. I'm sure we could have went on for at least another hour or two discussing the things that you were remiss to not involve in your presentation. So thank you for that. Before I pass the panel on to Manish, who will provide some questions, I just have two questions. One in particular to Peter, and then one kind of a general base to the panelists here. The first one for Peter is, and it's kind of what you highlighted for the United States with a U.S. perspective, but can you elaborate on the significance of the compacts of free associations, the bilateral agreements between the United States and the Republic of the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and the Republic of Palau? And for the audience who may not be familiar with these are essentially military clauses that give the United States exclusive rights to maintain defense assets in their territorial lands and waters in exchange for receiving a variety of funding and services. And then I would also be remiss if I didn't also say that these associations also allow the United States to prevent any other power or state from docking or harboring their ships there. So going forward, should the United States, focus on these compacts of free associations? Because if I remember correctly, I believe that the majority of them are either expiring in 2023 or 2024. And if Oceania and the Pacific Islands are a key strategic periphery for an Indo-Pacific strategy for the United States in maintaining its status quo in terms of its maritime hegemony and having key access points in order to compete and maybe eventually confront China in the future. Are these fundamental bilateral agreements that need to be renegotiated, or is this something that depending on who's in the White House, can actually wait, and then maybe a different strategy can be pursued?
Okay, so you want me to answer that? Okay, so I'm going to say a few things, and again, this is where the disclaimer matters because I'm not talking for the U.S. government. I'm going to say some very blunt things. So the first thing I'll say is, I think we are coming to this late. I mean, obviously, some of these many decades, but we're coming to them late in the fact that we should have paid more attention over term. And in fact, the United States government is big and complicated. We can walk and chew gum at the same time, and we should have paid more attention to these kind of issues rather than after the Solomon Islands kind of mini crisis. This should have been an issue, and there's two reasons. And the first is the geoeconomic, which is, look, these places and spaces, even in the far reaches of the Western Pacific, are central to the transit of goods and services across the country, and not just over the surface, seabeds and seabed mining, but also things like cables and the interconnection of the global telecommunications networks. But even more importantly, from a strategic military political perspective, as I said in my presentation, as the PLAN becomes larger and more of a blue water navy, the possibility that it'll use these places as part of and forgive me for this term, an anti-access strategy or an area denial strategy becomes greater. And I think this is where the Solomon Islands thing began to get the attention in Washington and left people thinking we need to renew these other agreements and we should do so expeditiously. The last thing I'll say is everything in peacetime is up for grabs in wartime. And God forbid there is a serious shooting conflict that other countries have to make choices. It's unclear that the United States can enforce or maintain these, particularly under the pressure. The PRC is not without a vote, as they say in strategic terms. So this is a competitive space. This is great power competition over very small places with the outsized geographic and geopolitical impact.
Thank you, Peter. And now I'll direct my second question to Professor Nagao and Professor Sato, and that's something that kind of Jeff, who's no longer with us, alluded to in his presentation, is that when we see the growing competition and the engagement that's going on between that's guiding Sino-US kind of tensions, is that the United States is very good at building, maritime ententes, building maritime hub and spoke systems of alliances, building partnerships, and China is often isolated on its own. So the question I want to pose to the two of you is, how important are the Pacific Islands in Oceania and in the Western Pacific to China's regional engagement scheme? In particular, is it more ideologically driven in the sense that it's trying to establish connections in order to get relationships with states that will then proceed to favor China, either in economic or military security areas? Or is it more hegemonic? Is China trying to pursue these island states to essentially expand its hegemony and its control, whether that be through soft power or hard power means, to essentially prevent the United States from engaging the region and providing and permitting its support in its hub and spoke systems and allowing its partners to flourish in an environment that's increasingly more competitive?
Maybe it's yeah. Maybe Professor Sato first. I should because he's senior.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Nagao-san. Yeah, I think China's kind of penetration into the Pacific Island region, I think it varies from one island to another, but let me first talk about South Pacific. In the South Pacific, you know, the Chinese, you know, shops selling, you know, food items and stuff like that are quite common. You know, you can find the Chinese chop suey on the island of Tonga, and the chop suey food is quite popular among the Tongans. Those Chinese have very little to do with the Chinese state. You know, the Chinese were, you know, outgoing people historically, and they have migrated and settled down in different locations. And they have pretty much, you know, integrated into the local community, although, you know, some racial issues remains. And, you know, when Tonga had a riot, the Chinese shops got burned down. So that sort of things happen. But those Chinese people have very little to do with the Chinese state. But I think in other places, we started seeing a greater infusion of Chinese, especially the laborers. And, you know, in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port construction happened, and China brought laborers. And I'm not sure about Sri Lanka, but in other places, Chinese laborers, they don't leave. After the construction's completed, they just stay. And so that kind of scale of, you know, kind of artificial migration promoted by the Belt and Road Initiative is, I would say that the state's conscious effort to, you know, establish greater Chinese presence in those regions. So if we start seeing that in Pacific Islands, perhaps that's when you know that the effort is really systematic, and the Chinese state is, you know, becoming hegemonic.
Person Nago, do you have any comment?
My answer is very simple. When we check China's investment, China's investment is far bigger than their economic benefit in the South Pacific. So that's why I can say security is a priority for China, not economic security. So to protect their coastal cities, China want to push the US as far as possible. That is their strategy in this place, I think. So that's why the Chinese admirals said something, the joke, we cannot laugh. And so divide the Pacific, the eastern side is the US, western side is China, or something like that. So security is their thinking, I think.
Perfect.
Can I respond to Nagao-san's comment? Yeah. I think somebody spoke of Tinian earlier, so let me share my story about Tinian. Have you been to Tinian? It's yeah, I think it was Nagao-san who spoke about Tinian. And Tinian is a small island off Saipan, and previously there was a kind of ferry boat between Saipan and Tinian to transport a large number of you know, casino tourists from China. And Tinian's economy is very agrarian and very indigenous, but in the middle of that, there's this big casino building. And I went there, I stayed there for a few days, and obviously the business is not making profit. I mean, every day it's losing money. the casino tables are so empty that my dad didn't feel like playing. But the hotel, is staffed with, adequate number of employees, and obviously it's a money-losing business. But it's been in business for last 30 years at least. And my question is why? I don't think it's strategic interest. I think it's money laundering. And I've seen similar things in Cambodia also. The China owns a building, and the tenants are also a Chinese company, but the tenants are obviously not making money. Locals are telling, oh, that shop is always, closed, or, there are so many things like that overseas, and we tend to think everything is strategic, but, oftentimes, China is such a corrupt state, and the money laundering is actually a big part of what China is doing in this, BRI and other economic initiatives.
Perfect. Now I'll just pass on to Manjis to ask a few questions before we close off this panel. So Manjis, do you want to go ahead and ask a few questions for the panelists? You're just on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much. My first question would be to Professor Satoru Nagao. It's a macro level question. So is there a shift of focus from war on terror to strategic competition between global powers, especially the US and China in the Indo-Pacific region? So do you see the shift from the Middle East going to the Indo-Pacific?
From war on terror or from the Russia aggression to Ukraine?
No, the war on terror from the Middle East to the Indo-Pacific.
Of course,
let's say,
when we check, when we check the U.S. move, for example, where the U.S. troop is located, it is clear the U.S. is focusing on the Indo-Pacific. Recent published national security strategy of the United States clearly mentioned that China is the only competitor to challenge the U.S. leads world order. So that's why the U.S. is focusing on China, not other issue like the terror or the Russia. Of course, Russia's aggression to Ukraine is currently a very important issue. But in the long run, Russia is poor. When we check their economy, they depend on the export of their natural resources. So that's why in the long run, Russia is not a strong competitor against the United States. China is rich. That means that China will be the real competitor against the United States. So in this case, for the United States, who is the main competitor, main rival, of course, China. So that's why the main focus. Of course, the United States only superpower. Their influence decides which area is the center of the world politics. That's why China is the main focus, not Islamic terrorism. But at the same time, we should not forget after U.S. withdrew from Afghanistan, that the Islamic terrorism has increased in 50% in Pakistan, 51% in Pakistan. So that's why we cannot forget the Islamic terrorism completely. But at the same time, currently China is issue. And one more thing I need to point out: if Russia continues the war in Ukraine, U.S. troops need to stay in Europe to support NATO countries. And at the same time, the European country or other country depend on the energy source in the Middle East. In this case, we cannot forget the Middle East too. So in this, China is a main rival or challenger against the United States. That's obvious. But at the same time, because of the other issues, the Russian aggression, Ukraine, because of the issues increasing Islamic terrorism, we cannot completely wipe out these issues from our heads. That is my opinion.
Okay, yeah. One more question. We have a Quad, which is a consortium of democracies which have come together. India, Japan, Australia, and the US. So, is there a way to contain China in the long run, taking into consideration of the docile foreign and defense policies of ASEAN nations? Do you see the ASEAN nations not taking a position as far as China is going? Are they sitting on the fence?
This is a very important question. Of course, last one is also important. But indeed, in my opinion, yes, if we can create something good alliances against expanding China, that is ideal situation. But each country has each interest. It is not easy to achieve that. That's also the fact. But at the same time, the four countries, the Quad countries, share the same interest against China, because China is assertive not only against Pacific side, but also the Indian-China border or Indian Ocean side. When we check the number of China's incursion, sea around Senkaku Island in the East China Sea, of course, Senkaku Island of Japan in the East China Sea. In 2012, China increased the number of the ships to enter the sea around Senkaku Island. And after that, stable. And in 2009, it will increase again. When we check the numbers, China's incursion in the India-China border in the mountain area, indeed, the same thing that happened. In 2012, this number has increased, and after that, steadily, and in 2009, increased again. So this means that India and Japan share the same problem. Maybe something, the reason is existing China side, and China increase, China provoke both sides at the same time. It is not easy to count the number in the South China Sea, very complicated, but there's a possibility that China increase activity in the same year in the South China Sea. So that's why this region, Japan, Southeast Asia, India, share the same problem. So if so, we should cooperate each other. And if we cooperate, we can divide China's military expenditure, the multi-front, against Japan, against India, against South China Sea. In this case, it is more easy to maintain military balance against China. China increased their military expenditure very drastic pace. And according to the CIPRI's information, last decade, from 2011 to 2020, they increased 76%. During the same period, the US decreased 10%. Japan increased only 2.4%. That is a ridiculous number, but China's case is 76%. So how to maintain military balance is very important. So dividing their military expenditure, multi-front is an effective way, alternative way. If our defense budget or military expenditure is not enough. So that is why the Quad is effective because of the location. East side is Japan, the southern side is India, and the US can deal with everything, and Australia can support South China Sea, the Taiwan, eastern side, and also Indian Ocean side. So this cooperation is very important, and we should do that. That is first thing. Sorry, my explanation is a little long, but a little bit, maybe could you give me the time? Indeed,
yeah, sure.
I explained China and Russia. I try to compare China and Russia, and Russia is Bagara and China is safe, I said. Why? Because Russia uses military power and China uses economic power. Indeed, China's threat is based on the money, indeed. Because China is rich, China increased their military expenditure so rapid pace. Because they are rich, the Belt and Road Initiative, the investment, the infrastructure project create a huge depot and control these countries, the control the recipients. So that's why China is rich. That is a problem. So how to take their income? That is another matter. And so that along with the military balance. So that's why we're focusing on the creating alternative market, the check, and focusing on the economic security checks, supply chain, or how we try to set up the rule. China cannot steal the technology from us. But this kind of economic security is very important. simply the economic issue is main part of the counter-China strategy. In this case, international rule or cooperation of the Quad, AUKUS, or the cooperation between Japan, India, US, Australia, and Southeast Asia. These are very important because Southeast Asia is also the rising economy. So that's why how to control the China's rise. In this case, cooperation with these countries is very important, key, I think, both military and economically. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nagao. My next question would be to Peter. Peter, if you see NATO, Europe, there's only one multilateral alliance. But if you see the Indo-Pacific region, there are multiple alliances on the bilateral scale. There is US-South Korea, then US-Japan alliance, then the AUKUS, there's a Quad. How can China be contained in the long run by various scattered patchwork of bilateral and multilateral defense treaties?
So let me start with the premise. I don't know that it's wise to think of the relationship between the United States and other countries in the region and China as in terms of containment. I think that that left the building a long time ago. There is no possibility of containing China in the sense that we contained the Soviet Union. So I think that's probably not a good goal. The second thing is that I don't believe that the Pacific allies, this hub and spoke model where the United States is a hub and everybody else sort of generates off it, but there's lesser connections between, I don't think it leads to a NATO-like structure in a long time. It's been many decades, but I think there is greater collaboration and cooperation amongst the various American partners with each other in the region. And it goes from everything from military exercises like Malabar to Cobra Gold with Thailand. It also goes to this defense technology relationship with the Japanese and with the Australians and the British. But also, there's signs that the Japanese are working more closely with the Indians are working more closely with a variety of partners. And so I don't see a NATO-like structure trying to contain China, but I do see a more flexible sort of alliance system that has a lot of strengths and a lot of flexibility and a lot of resilience over time. But it's a great question. I don't think we can expect containment, and I don't think we can expect a formal military alliance as we see as in Europe.
Thank you very much, Peter. I will hand over for the next question answer to Andrew.
Thank you, Manji. So with that final question, I just kind of want to leave off on kind of a high note, and that's something we've all kind of indicated, which is the concept of Oceania and the Western Pacific and the island states that encompass that is vital. It's vital both to Chinese for Chinese kind of maritime hegemony. It's important for America to maintain its status quo position within the region as well. So I guess the last question I would just want to ask before we conclude is that, and it goes to what kind of Manish was saying, is what implications does the Ukrainian war have on this region? As Professor Sato kind of indicated, with Chinese artificial migration into these areas, and what we see Russia doing in Ukraine, saying that, well, because there's Russian ethnic speakers there's Russian, we perceive as Russian citizens, therefore we have legitimate grounds to invade and to annex these territories. Are there possible rhythms that China could then incorporate into their strategy, seeing that, although these actions from Russia have been condemned by NATO and the Western liberal democratic partners, it was still able to do that. So is there any opportunity that China could adopt this, but concentrate it to much more of a Sino-centric strategy for its sovereignty, whether it be for political, its civilian, or its territorial integrity going forward? And this is open to the entire panel.
I could say one two quick things. So on the particular question about Ukraine and the lessons, I think we have to be very careful. And I think we have to be very careful, particularly in applying them to China and the Taiwan case, which is very popular in the press. I think it's far more complicated than that. I think we can learn some lessons about the changing nature of war, particularly high technology war. I won't bore you with them, but I think that expectations about cyber and cyber's role have been somewhat diminished by the course of the war. It's the dog that hasn't barked. I think expectations of the ability of missiles to be war and long-range artillery to be war-winning hasn't played out yet, although there's time to come. I think that notions of quick conquest, whether it's Ukraine or Taiwan or anywhere else, particularly between great powers or countries supported by great powers, is really mistaken. If you have a great power on one side or the other, no matter how high technology, there's no quick fix to winning a war. It's a long slog. It's tremendously destructive, tremendously defensive, which is tremendously expensive, which is why we have to work on deterrence. And I do want to say one more thing, and this is too much time, but so I really appreciated the comments of my other panelists. And I think it was Professor Sato that said this, and I may be wrong. Not everything is strategic. I think that's exactly right. I mean, the world is way too complicated. And this is particularly to the Americans. I mean, Americans think we have control and think we can, push these levers, and it's just not true. There's no set of economic or political or diplomatic interests that makes the American get its way in the Western Pacific. We need to pay attention to friends and allies and adversaries in a deep way. And so this is my last pitch, which is the book you mentioned in my bio is actually not my last, is two more. One is on comparative grand strategy, and the other one is American strategy in a comparative perspective. And there's a case study on there of US grand strategy vis-a-vis the Chinese and the Indians in the Indo-Pacific. And what I would like to say about that is grand strategy is a great concept, but again, the world is more complicated, and the notion that Delhi or Beijing or Washington actually controls this very multifaceted region is probably a fantasy. We should study it and think about it, and I talked about it in my presentation, but the population and climate change and economic factors outweigh the ability of bureaucrats sitting in one of these countries to really control. Over.
Thank you, Peter. Professor Nagawa, Professor Sato, do you have anything to follow up or to address the question that was posed?
Maybe Professor Sato.
Oh, okay, thank you. I think Nagao-san's being Japanese and seniority matters here, right? Yeah, I think in today's discussion, I think we had good, well-informed American thought presented, and that is that Indo-Pacific is fundamentally important for the United States in terms of economy and in terms of the security. My big question is this shared by a majority of the Americans who would choose the next president? And that is I think, biggest variable when we talk about the course of the international relations in this region. And I'm not sure, if the Trump gets reelected, he would leave the big strategy to more traditional security planners, like during the first Trump administration, or he becomes more assertive and drive the US into an isolationist course. So that's something I would keep watching. Thank you.
And Professor Nagao?
In this case, there are plenty of the scenario you can imagine, but worst case scenario, I imagine it's China will increase the power during Russia's aggression to Ukraine. That scenario is something like that. Because Russia depend on China more in this case as a source of the as a customer of the natural resources from Russia. And because of the China's influence toward Russia, or China's influence toward Putin in this case, that's why China can get more military technology from Russia. And that's why China can get many chances in this case, in this worst case scenario. And after the Russia aggression to Ukraine, of course, time has come to rebuild Ukraine. In this case, China can invest to Ukraine, so China will expand the influence not on Russia but also to Ukraine. But U.S. side need to deal with Europe and the Middle East more. That's why U.S. cannot relocate their military resources to the Indo-Pacific. That's why to counter China's influence, U.S. cannot get enough resources. That is the worst case scenario, and we want to avoid. So, worst case scenario, because we can expect, we try to avoid. So I cannot say it will happen. But at the same time, we should prepare for that kind of scenario, and we try to prevent that kind of scenario. That is things we need to do, I believe.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Before I pass it back to Indo for closing remarks, I just want to take this time to thank the panelists for presenting your case, presenting your remarks, and for answering the questions that we had. It's gratefully appreciated, and it's useful in our discussions and in our endeavor to understand this region much more and to kind of get a holistic approach of what not just China and the United States is doing, but what the Indo-Pacific states are doing in the middle and the different variations of powers in the region as well. So thank you very much. Indo?
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much, everyone. That's for the wonderful presentation. I just like to mention that the interesting presentation by Peter. I like your black wild card and black swans slide, but again, that the peaceful rise and peaceful reunification is not such a thing in this complex, and it's a strategic environment when we are looking at the China and Russia. And Dr. Nagao, he mentioned clearly the Japan's concern and about India's concern, what China did in 2020 in Galwan face-off and in the border disputes. So it's also the concern, but again, the direct confrontation. And also that we see that containment and direct confrontation from the United States is not possible. And again, then Professor Sato mentioned that is this the American view and how many Americans have that kind of view. This is certainly not the majority of Americans think like that. So again, we are in the very complex world, and the term that has come up, the poly crisis, it's not the one crisis here, and how to get out of this, and what should, there is a sovereignty and national security and climate and pandemic war. So that's why we choose this topic, the great power competition, a challenge to the rule-based order, and we divided in Indo-Pacific regions. So thank you so much for your insightful, thoughtful discussion. And we will share the video with you, and thank you.
Thank you very much.